Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. Well, perhaps you've been thinking that all of Jonathan Edwards' writings were somewhat esoteric in character and you had to search hard for the practical implications. Well, not so. He was a preacher and a pastor, and so he wrote and spoke many things which were very practical, but among them, most notably, were not so much his sermons, but one piece that really stands out that he's famous for are his so-called resolutions. This is a collection of 70 personal commitments that he wrote when he was quite a young man, 19 or 20 years old, which represented attempts that he was going to make to grow in godliness and maturity consistently throughout his life. He added to them over a period of about a year, and he committed to reading through them every week for the rest of his life. And they're quite remarkable because they show us the kind of practical spirit of the man and the way in which he put his deep learning to work, so to speak, to try and discipline himself to help himself to grow in godliness and faithfulness towards Christ. I want to highlight a couple for you. In particular, let's have a look at number 8. Here's how it goes. Resolved, he writes, to act in all respects, both speaking and doing, as if nobody had been so vile as I, and as if I had committed the same sins, or had the same infirmities or failings as others, and that I will let the knowledge of their failings promote nothing but shame in myself, and prove only an occasion of my confessing my own sins and misery to God. Well, what's all that about? Well, Edwards is wrestling with the simple fact, which we're all aware of, that we have to live with one another. And we become conscious as we do so in our families and among our friends and our church community and elsewhere, that we ourselves are sinners and people around us are sinners. None of us is perfect, and none of the people in your family and among your friends is perfect either. And what that means is we have to try and figure out what we're going to do when we, so to speak, bump into each other, rub each other up the wrong way, where your sins, so to speak, start getting in my face. And the great temptation here is to point the finger. The great temptation here is to exalt ourselves above one another and to act towards the other person, so to speak, as though I'm above them and they're beneath me because this sin is so grievous and heinous and ungodly. And that's what Edwards wants to backtrack from. Notice what he says. First, to act in all respects, both speaking and doing, as if nobody had been so vile as I. Just pause there for a second. It's to make the starting assumption that I'm the chief of sinners. Not this person who's just wound me up. Not this individual who's just irritated me or who I've heard has been gossiping about me. But as if I'm the greatest of sinners, because probably, truth be told, that's more true than I'm inclined to realise. But then he goes on. And as if I had committed the same sins or had the same infirmities or failings as others. Well, because it's a safe bet that probably we have. In other words, when we are trying to deal with our response to somebody who we think has done wrong, maybe towards us or towards somebody else, never to forget that we ourselves are very likely guilty of exactly the same thing, perhaps even worse than the same thing. So we come, as one theologian has put it, not Jonathan Edwards, I think, but somebody else, as blind sinners showing other blind sinners where we have found bread. We don't come to those situations as though we are in the right and you are in the wrong. We recognise that we have been in the wrong in the past as well. Now, it's just fascinating to think about this, what this would do to our relationships. What would it do to our relationships with one another, the way we behave towards one another, if we always approached those kinds of situations with a self-conscious recognition that, first of all, we are closer to being the chief of sinners than we realise, and that this particular thing which has upset me or annoyed me or which I think is so wrong or out of place, I've been guilty of exactly the same thing. Wouldn't that shape quite dramatically how we interact with each other? And not just sins that Edwards is talking about. You notice the same infirmities. I think this suggests not just moral failings, but what we might regard as ways in which we personally feel vulnerable or weak. Think about what we were speaking of a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about helping people deal with anxiety and depression and so on. Well, how would it transform our relationships in that context if we realised that, self-consciously realised that is, that in trying to help somebody deal with anxiety, this isn't something we should just get irritated and impatient with, but we are perfectly capable of having the same infirmities and weakness as they. And indeed, we may have had precisely the same infirmities or weaknesses as they, or if we'd been in their position, we would have had. And then notice how he continues. To let the knowledge of their failings promote nothing but shame in myself, and prove only an occasion of my confessing my own sins and misery to God. Isn't that remarkable? I mean, he was a pastor, and one suspects that as he came to read this in his later years, in his 30s and 40s, when he was actually having to deal with people who, truth be told, on one or two occasions weren't behaving in the most godly way, he must have wondered about this, to prove only an occasion of confessing my own sins and misery to God. And yet he didn't, as far as we can make out, strike this out. He didn't think this was inconsistent with pointing out in a gracious way where we need to other people's failings. But certainly in the first instance, to see what we believe that somebody else has done that's just out of line, and to turn that back to ourselves and to recognise, hold on, I need to confess sins of mine that I've committed which are just like that. How would those things transform our lives and our relationships with each other? Well, we'll look at another one of these resolutions tomorrow, Lord willing. Meanwhile, God bless you. Hope to see you soon. Bye for now.